Why does your studio always take, and I mean this in a positive way, go the extra mile? Because it's very easy to just be like, yeah, Cowbun Collection, here's all the games in a pub, just click them and play them and you're done. But you guys go even a step further and you get into the history, you guys scan original artwork, you go out of your way to look at archives and include them in the game in some way or form, you make soundtrack playlists, like you do all these extra things that in a normal, like in the 360 era, you wouldn't even see. It would just be like, here's the Tetris collection, and you just play the Tetris games and that's it.
Yeah. I mean, I really distill it down to this, and I'm sure everyone has their own sort of reasons for this, but really, I think it boils down to a passion for the things that we are releasing as far as the properties and the IPs, and sort of this innate desire for each individual team member to sort of over deliver on that stuff. We've been fortunate enough to always work so far on franchises that we are personally engaged with and are fans of ourselves. And inherently, I think when you have a team of fans of the property that you're working on, they innately will put forth a bunch of extra effort in that regard too. And you know, it's just in our DNA to do that. Like, we want to put a smile on people's faces. I think from Chris, and Chris can go into this more, but like just the desire to go out and sort of an Indiana Jones sort of scenario, to go out and be able to find things that people have not seen before, that give sort of a historical context or just context in general about these properties, to sort of teach you why they're important, why you should care, is a big thing for us. Because I think a failure of some of the collections that get released in general is that they just throw some games in with some art. They rely on the nostalgia purely of fans, and they don't bother to sort of provide a reason why you should be excited or care about these properties. And I think that's something that we tend to always try to do in a meaningful way. You know, Chris, I don't know if you want to add to that, or anyone else.
I mean, I'm gonna go even further and say, I mean, we believe that the video game industry needs to start treating its like classic games in the same way that we treat classic films, classic literature. We don't believe that they're given the proper amount of respect. And so by going further, you know, again, like, we do not want to do what everybody else is doing and sort of like crank out a $20 budget version where we just sort of throw all the games in there and like, well, here you go, because that's doing a disservice to the games, and it's just doing a disservice to our own history. We must, you know, we have to go the extra mile. We have to put these in their proper context. We have to treat these collections like, not to say big budget, but you know what I mean? Like, we have to treat them as big re-releases of these classic games, because it is important. You know, they should be treated with respect. We should be trying to, you know, remaster and, you know, present them the way that they were originally played. You know, a game is not just a ROM file. You know, when you bought a game and you got the box and the manual, and not only that, but just like if we can include things from the video game magazines of the time, or show what the culture around it was, that going the extra mile is what we feel that these games deserve. They don't deserve to be just this sort of a hat, because in a lot of cases, it's just sort of like, oh, right, like, well, yeah, we got to put something out using that IP again. But if you just keep doing that and saying, oh yeah, here you go, here's that game again, you're just waiting around for that IP to basically die. Like, we can, as Stephen was saying, create new fans. You know, we can revitalize something that's been dormant, but you can only really do that by like treating it with the proper amount of respect. And what I hope that we do, we're trying to sort of like hold up the lantern and light the way, because if other, you know, game publishers that don't work with us, but if they start looking at what we've done and they said, yeah, that's the way to do it, that was a big success, if they start doing that with their properties, I'm happier, because I get to play, you know, collections in which I'm gonna see that bonus content. I'm going to see these games presented in a more respectful way, and continue to show people that, yeah, I can go, you know, The Godfather came out in 1972, you know, I love that movie and I watch it all the time. And I'm not saying that people have to sit and play Pong, you know, every year, but you know, it's getting to the point where it's not just a pure nostalgia play to want to go back and play these games. I mean, there is something that is, you know, continually appealing about them if we present them in a respectful and exciting way.
a good point. And you bring up the Godfather thing, so that, a lot of people in the movie industry go back and they look at these older films and they learn things from them, especially up and coming folks, right? And that's a key thing about these games as well. You can learn a lot from them. There is something intrinsically amazing about having a very straightforward, more simplistic kind of gaming experience that doesn't have smoke and mirrors. It doesn't have fancy FMV or anything to cloud sort of the experience. Like back then, when you made a game, the moment-to-moment experience had to be engaging and fun. Otherwise, that's it. You're done with, right? And I think people today, from across all aspects of this industry, can look at these sort of earlier titles and learn a lot from playing them. And so being able to have them be more accessible now to a larger audience, I think, is only a win-win.
I feel like a lot of companies could learn from what Digital Eclipse has done and continues to do. Biggest example, Nintendo. They really need to contact you and have you do some of their ports for them, because they are not doing so well right now.
We're always available. The phone
right.
is
hire them.
anytime
Nintendo, hire them.
you want to reach out.
Yeah. Come on, let's
Miyamoto has my number. Just give me a call,
Right.
buddy. No problem.
Getting into a bit about the licensing, can you guys, because in the late 70s and early 80s, even up to the 90s, contract work and work in video games was a lot different than it is today. Is there any specific things you can talk about? I mean, did you have to call individuals up, like on the personal phone, be like, hey, we'd love to use your game in this, we need your permission? Or was it more, do you have any fun stories like that, tracking down these IPs for the Jaguar and Atari and stuff, these 50-year-old games?
Well, it's sort of a mix of stuff. So fortunately, we had a good partner in the form of Atari, who obviously owns a lot of this stuff themselves and made it sort of a bit easier. We did go out actively and reach out to specific groups, like the team that created Yoomp, for example, which is a great ad, sort of a homebrew ad that came later. And so we reached out to some folks, but the challenges now, like you said, there is sort of this nebulous uncertainty in a lot of cases about who exactly owns what, right? In some cases, it's very clear, like Activision holds a very select number of the IPs, and other companies hold a certain number of these titles and stuff like that. And so we did do some initial exploration and reaching out. In some cases, like Yoomp, in other cases, we were able to get clearance and add them. In other situations, you just get bogged down in this large corporate entity with the wheels turning, and it takes months and months, and you're just like, it gets very frustrating because, it's like, it's a very simple thing. We just want to even include like this image of this game or this, and it becomes like this very arduous kind of process. And part of that is, again, because of the amount of time, there is uncertainty about, do we actually own this? And we've actually run across this during this project. We've been talking to folks who think that they own something and are like, yeah, you can use it, and then finding out that they actually have no ownership of it. So, it's very complex and difficult. So that's why it was at least nice to be able to have Atari and their cachet of titles to at least fall back on, and then supplement it with what we could. And Atari has partnerships with some other companies who own rights to some of the games, and we were able to engage with them as well.
And sometimes we go back and we let people know that they own things that they didn't even know
right,
that they own.
Exactly. It's mind-boggling.
Nobody's thought about it for a really long time.
The Atari systems and even the Jaguar had a very unique control scheme, and it seems very like just macro the buttons, whatever, duplicate the buttons on a controller or keyboard or whatever. But was there any challenge in doing that with some of these unique controls to maybe get that Atari feeling? Because I don't remember a lot about the Jaguar, but I do remember the controller hurt my hands.
Oh yes, the numerical pad. Dave was our savior in a lot of ways with that stuff. He worked a lot of hours, both him and Jeremy, especially on analog control support and things like that. But Dave was really a key force. I'll let him chime in, but he did a lot of work on the control stuff.
Yeah, there were a lot of challenges across the board. I guess all the systems are so unique, right? 2600 has switches, hardware switches, and those are used in different ways in different games. Like Secret Quest, for example, uses a flip of the select switch up and down, like toggle that action actually equates to a particular status screen in the game. So we had to sort of like add a lot of special case inputs for the 2600, and then all the way to the Jaguar. I mean, the Jaguar's controller, I'm sure you've seen this at some point, but there's a lot of buttons, right? There's a lot of buttons. You've got a numpad essentially there. So how do we take all of those inputs and make them work on a standard controller, right? An Xbox controller or a PlayStation controller, etc. So that was a bit of a challenge. And at one point we added a radial menu, and the radial menu allows you to access some of these controls just by using a flip of the right analog stick in order to make those inputs happen. And, we don't have to worry about having all these other buttons and work, So that was another big challenge. Also, the 5200 also has a numpad built into it. So we had to do the same thing there in some of those games, like Star Raiders is a great example of that, where it's a very complicated game. It's hard to understand if you just try to play it out of the box, right? The manual is very in-depth. So we went really far in different ways, particularly adding the radio menu to that one, but also adding prompts on the screen, adding a lot of special case inputs, so it feels really, really natural. And in some of our playthroughs, we had some kids come in and play it, and they actually finished the game. And it's mind-blowing that they finished the game, because looking at this game without having those inputs, it would just be very challenging.
And not just prompts on the screen either. It was, a full HUD where the game is in 4:3 in the middle, but we've used the surrounding 16:9 widescreen space to create like a cockpit with all of these lights that are tied into RAM addresses that highlight features that, as a player, back in 1980, you would just have to know. You would have to know in your mind what state the ship is in, but we now present that in a way that's a lot more friendly.
Yeah, another great thing we did, and Jeremy did a lot of work on this, is sort of emulating or simulating the analog inputs that go across the board from the arcade games all the way through the console games as well. Even in the 2600 games, we were able to make analog inputs work. I don't know, Jeremy, if you want to detail on that.
We've done a lot of collections that emulate, console games like the NES, Super NES, and also arcade games that are joystick and button based, and those translate really well to gamepad. But when you're talking about the 2600 paddle controller or a steering wheel or an analog thruster,
or a yoke,
right? Yeah. Or some arcade games even have analog joysticks, which happen to map very well to a gamepad. We could take advantage of that and do it right. And in the case of the paddle controllers and any kind of analog inputs, we spent a long time making that feel great on a gamepad. But then we also support every input you could imagine. The PlayStation controller, the touch on that, as well as the Switch touchscreen, mouse on PC.
Oh wow!
Atari actually makes a joystick right now. It's called the wireless classic controller. That looks like a 2600 joystick, but the stick actually is a spinner as well.
Yeah, it spins, so you could do other. Yeah, so you don't have to have for pawing and stuff. Made it a little easier.
Exactly, and so we support that on PC, and it's probably the best way to play Tempest because it's an infinite spinning device, just like the dial was. So we did everything we could to support, anything that people might have, and that was a lot of fun. It just took a lot of time, but every game has a dialed-in specification for how the gamepad stick should feel, and what how far should you push it to create what effect on the screen, and we gave it a real good shot, and I'm real happy with how that ended up.
Yeah, I just want to point out, Jeremy makes it easy, but what people don't take into account is that all the controllers are very different. The size of the dead zones, there's so much variations between all these different controllers and things like that, and so it became a very iterative project. Jeremy and Mike and other folks were just sit there and just adjusting over and over and over again. How does it feel? How should it feel? Right. And so it's something that I think that people tend to take for granted, and that oh, whatever, controls, whatever. But it's very difficult, especially when you have so many different platforms, having just the feel of the analog, how it should feel in relation to how it felt in the arcade. How do you recapture that on a modern controller, which is very different from that. So a lot of work was really put into that.
Yeah, I always feel like when I hear people talk about porting controls, they're like, well, just port the mouse pointer to the analog stick. And I'm like, but there's a feel to that. You don't just flip a switch. You can do that, but it's probably going to be miserable. You need to tune that. That needs to be hand tuned. You can't just hit a button and have it be done.
Exactly.
On top of that, you talked about other peripherals, not just the controllers across the Atari home systems, but in the 70s, Atari really liked to experiment with different peripherals on their arcade machines. In Tempest, Star Wars, Asteroids, the Rollerball, all these different inputs that don't necessarily transform well to a controller, especially if they're older. Because I remember playing Missile Command in the arcades, and I had to do this because the ball was so dirty. You had to just really to move the reticle ever so little.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, we experimented a lot with
Oh.
that. Initially, we had momentum. Like if you were to move it with the gamepad stick, like I tried to emulate a trackball. You know, if you swipe a trackball, it keeps moving a little bit and slows down. But that was uncontrollable, so we had to back that off. But on touchscreen, we do that. Like if you have a touch device, because you can swipe your finger and stop, and that'll stop your pointer, or you can swipe and let go immediately, and that will create momentum. So we did that where we could. In a few of the games, we actually do something unique that it was Mike Micah's idea, where in Centipede and Millipede and Tempest and Aka R, well, which are all trackball games or or spinner games. If you move around, you move very quickly. But if you hold the fire button, you start moving slightly slower, which gives you a little more accuracy. And it's a feature you can turn off, but it's a really innovative thing, and it makes it play really well on gamepad. And it allows you to be a lot more accurate with your shots, as you would be if you were playing the game in the arcade while you're firing, but then also traverse the levels as fast as you need to reach the later stages.
It's at one point we were talking about making the arcade games age as you played them. So I know this is kind of like if we can do that, if we ever have time to do this, we're going to do it. We would actually change the bezels over time. And so you'd see like a stain or like quarters, whatever, sort of lining up. And it would have been really funny if we also made the trackball get dirty over time. And then you had to like clean it or something like that. Anyway,
With alcohol. I remember those days. I mean, you guys can already taking the mouse ball out and cleaning it when it wasn't working right. What's a laser? Those laser mice were expensive.